really good to be back. And I started this university the year after I finished my PhD. And it was just when the Polytechnic had turned into the university, and there was this kind of big splurge of new staff, like people like myself and Fritz, a few years before Susan arrived. And the Vice-Chancellor at the time, Professor Anne Wright, welcomed us all at the induction and said, you do realise that Sunderland is the oldest centre of higher education in the United Kingdom? And our jaws kind of dropped. He said, well, actually you realise that up there at St Peter's, that was the centre of European civilization during the Kingdom of Northumbria. So it's older than Oxford, older than Cambridge. So we all had a kind of patted ourselves on the back when we heard this. Right, so this is the St Peter's campus of the University of Sunderland. And it's a very Gothic place because St Peter's Church, which was built in the 20 years from 683, is the oldest Gothic church in this country. St Peter's Church was the first stone building built in England after the Roman invaders left. So there's a period of hundreds of years. And then suddenly, Sunderland becomes a beacon of Gothic learning. Gothic in its early days, before Horace Walpole's pioneering first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto, in 1764, simply meant medieval. So in other words, the period between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance, 1,000 years of civilization, patronisingly known as the Dark Ages and then the later Middle Ages. So the Dark Ages are there's a period between the fall of Rome in the 5th and 6th century and the 11th century, when this country is invaded by the Normans. Then we have the later Middle Ages, the ages of Chaucer and so on. But St Peter's Church is one of the oldest Gothic buildings in Western Europe. And it was a home to a famous monastery of the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Northumbria. And you see on the right an example of Old English Gothic script. This is the first page of that famous poem, Beowulf. And you will see that it's written in a language which is as near to a foreign language in this day and age as makes no difference. But this is Gothic script. And it's entirely possible that Beowulf was written in Wearmouth, which is now modern-day Sunderland. There are two theories about the composition of Beowulf. One is that it was composed somewhere between in North Yorkshire, possibly in York. The other, that it was arguably composed in this neck of the woods in the northeast. Now, it remains a rather Gothic place to this day. This is these rather unsavoury-looking characters are the staff of the Sunderland University, staff and students of the Sunderland University English department in all their finery last year. So 1,000 years of Gothicry at Sunderland. I'm writing a book about Romanticism between the walls, how Romanticism was understood in this period, particularly in this country amongst radical political artists, musicians and writers. And it became apparent to me in doing the preparatory work for the volume that there was a peculiar upsurge of interest in Great Britain and also in France in the Gothic novel in the 20s and 30s, in the interwar period. So today I want to talk about three things. I want to talk about the rise of the Gothic novel, of the Romantic period of which the Gothic is such an important part, and then I want to conclude by talking a wee bit about my current research into the way in which the Gothic novel was read in the 20s and in the 30s. Okay, so I'll begin with Gothic. As I said, the word Gothic originally simply meant medieval. There's a process of transference that changes that word from one meaning to a subsidiary meaning as well. So St Peter's out there, so before you leave, go 200 metres up the road, you will see that church. It's a Gothic church, a medieval church. The very first Gothic novels, which begin in the 1760s, are set in a monastic setting amongst monasteries, castles and abbeys. And they have a whole Gothic paraphernalia of Roman Catholic medieval settings and devices. Monks, nuns, tyrannous rulers, damsels in distress, and the whole Roman Catholic paraphernalia of southern Mediterranean medieval Europe. So what we're talking about in all three strands of my talk today is the art of the irrational. In European culture, there have been two particular strands of thought. The first is the classical or neoclassical model, in which you look back to the art of ancient Greece and Rome for your inspiration, to the work of Homer and Ovid and Virgil and so on. And also, on the other hand, a romantic way of looking at the world that begins in the later 18th century. And the Gothic novel is an important tributary into the wider romantic period, about which I'll talk in a minute. The third, and much later, art form I want to consider is Surrealism, which is an avant-garde artistic movement which begins in the early 1920s in Paris. But it has, it seems to me, important correlations between Surrealism and these two previous radical and revolutionary artistic movements, the Gothic and Romanticism. Okay, to begin with the Gothic. Okay, so this is Horace Walpole, the third Earl of Orford. That's not a typo for Oxford. He was the Earl of Orford, the first Gothic novelist. 1717 to 1797. This is a very rich and privileged and well-bred young man of Eton and Christchurch, Oxford, the son of Robert Walpole, who to this day remains the longest-serving British Prime Minister. He was the Whig Prime Minister for 30 years, from 1715. And his young man, his first son, Horace, is a brilliant, waspy, homosexually inclined dandy and dilettante. He is author of some of the best correspondence in English literature. The famous Yale edition of the Letters of Horace Walpole, which still continues, is in its 70th volume as we speak. But he's most famous for his interest in the Middle Ages. Those of you who know the canon of English literature will realise that in the mid-18th century, the prevailing artistic models are neoclassical. So the works of the likes of Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift and John Dryden, poets who look back to classical times, to the work of the Roman poets such as Juvenal and Ovid and Virgil, and then back to Homer and Aeschylus and the Greek tradition before it. But Walpole was kind of a literary radical inasmuch as he looked at the Middle Ages and saw something of value and something of importance within. So against the prevailing neoclassical consensus, Walpole began to write about the importance of the Middle Ages. He began to actually set himself up as an apologist for the Middle Ages, which were generally seen in this period as a kind of ropey period of barbarianism and violence. The very term, the Dark Ages, betokens the kind of disdain that the Middle Ages were suffering under in the 18th century. So this is Walpole's house. As I say, he's a tremendously wealthy fellow, and he builds this mansion at Strawberry Hill, West London, which is now the main campus building of Strawberry Hill University College. It used to be a Roman Catholic college, interestingly enough, given the preoccupations of the Gothic novel. So he designs this Gothic house, and then he writes a Gothic novel, and this is the title page, The Castle of Otranto, a Gothic story. And when Walpole denominates his story a Gothic story, he doesn't mean a tale of the supernatural or a tale about ghosts and the supernatural. Even though his tale is that, he simply means a medieval story. And this book is supposedly found in a monastery in northern Italy, and it's supposed to be hundreds of years old. Of course, that's kind of fiction. So it's a Gothic story inasmuch as it's a medieval story. In the 30 years after Walpole's book was published, the term Gothic came to change its meaning. So as well as meaning medieval, it also came to mean something dark, supernatural, and with a kind of pervading air of evil and terror and so on. Now, Walpole says that he wrote his story because he had a very odd dream of a Gothic castle. So the book comes out of a dream, as does Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Nightmare, which begins that novel, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Dracula. All three of these books take their inspiration in Nightmare, the nightmare of their authors. So Walpole says this: "A dreadful castle, a very natural dream for a head like mine, full of Gothic story." And he writes the book in less than a week, barely pausing to eat or drink or sleep. And he says it was written rapidly, as if without thought. The work, he says, grew on my hands, as if he was somehow not writing from his conscious brain, that he was writing from somewhere else. And this becomes very important later in the reading of the Gothic novel by the Surrealists. So here you see a 19th century handbill for a dramatisation of a transit. And you can see the top left, a gigantic helmet. And this becomes very important in that book, because the principal character of the book, Manfred, a villainous patriarchal prince, sees his son crushed to death by a huge metallic helmet which descends from the sky and squashes an unfortunate son to death. And of course, Freudian critics have made much of the symbolism of the young man crushed by the gigantic helmet. Okay, it's written in this rather kind of florid prose style. So I'll read you that scene when Manfred gets squashed to death by a helmet. A volley of voices replied, "Oh my lord, the prince, the helmet," shot with these lamentable sounds, and dreading he knew not what, Manfred advanced hastily. But what a sight for a father's eyes! He beheld his child dashed to pieces and almost buried under an enormous helmet, 100 times more large than any ever made for human being, and shaded with a proportionable quantity of black feathers. The horror of the spectacle took away the prince's speech. He examined the fatal casque, nor even could the bleeding mangled remains of the young prince divert the eyes of Manfred from the portent before him. So melodramatically inclined stuff. All right, so this is a book with a medieval setting and a Roman Catholic, and it's a book of particular importance, despite the fact that the kind of elephant in the room is that it's an absolutely rotten book that's kind of badly written and full of melodrama. David Daitches, the Scottish critic, said that there never was in the history of European culture a generic model as bad as this one. But from this rather mediocre book, we see this extraordinary development of horror story. So it's a medieval setting, specifically a Roman Catholic setting, back then. A story with fantastical plot development, allied to the modern tradition of the realist novel. So the 18th century, as you probably know, sees the development of the first English novels with Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe in 1719. And Walpole admires the modern new tradition of realist fiction in Defoe and in Samuel Richardson, and to a lesser extent Henry Fielding. But he also liked to read stories of medieval romance. This does not mean romance in a kind of Mills and Boon, St. Valentine's Day romance, but romance in the sense of stories of the Middle Ages, specifically tales of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. So here's an example of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is a 14th century anonymous poem written somewhere in the West Midlands. Right. Okay, so this is the title page of the Cotton Era manuscript in the British Museum. And you will see that what's happened here is that this Green Knight has appeared at the court of King Arthur, and he has challenged any of the knights, challenged King Arthur to cut his head off with a blow, on condition that 1 year hence that he can give a similar blow. And King Arthur volunteers to do it, but Gawain says, "No, this is beneath your dignity, sir, so I will do it." I think, what kind of idiot? I'll take his head off, so what could possibly happen? So Gawain removes the Green Knight's head with one blow, but unfortunately for Gawain, the Green Knight picks up his head and he starts talking. And it says, "I will see you in a year's time, and then I will administer the blow." So it's a test of daring do and moral courage. It's a very kind of, it's a book which is much concerned with the notion of knighthood and chivalry. But one thing we can safely say about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is that it is not true. because 8-foot-tall green men do not have their heads removed and start talking and then ride off on a horse. Okay? So it's a fantastical story. So Walpole says that what he was doing here was attempting to merge these two traditions. The modern realist novel of particularly Defoe and Richardson, and these supernatural tales of the Middle Ages. So it's a fusion of the ancient and the modern. So the ancient form of the Gothic novel was medieval tales of enchantment, witchcraft and chivalry. So there are ghosts, there are gigantic helmets, there are creatures from beyond the grave which walk through early Gothic fiction. The modern side is the 18th century contemporary novel of Defoe and the like. So it's a fusion of two literary traditions. Okay, so let's have a look at a definition of the Gothic from Chris Baldock's Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms. Those of you who are going to read English at university should avail yourself of a copy, because it's an extremely useful book which you will refer to throughout your university career. So, Baldock says this: a story of terror and suspense, usually set in a gloomy old castle or monastery, hence Gothic, a term applied to medieval architecture and thus associated in the 18th century with superstition. Ruth Mack, in a recent book on historiography, says the most basic claim one might make about the Gothic, it is about the privileging of imagination over reason, terror over truth. So following the appearance of the castle of Otranto, Walpole says, the Gothic novel flourished in Britain from the 1790s to the 1820s, dominated by Anne Radcliffe, whose Mysteries of Udolpho, 1794, had many imitators. She was careful to explain away the apparently supernatural occurrences in her stories, but other writers, like Matthew Gregory Lewis in The Monk, 1796, made free use of ghosts and demons, along with scenes of cruelty and horror. So in those two great novelists, Gothic novelists of the 1790s, there's a key difference between their work. Anne Radcliffe is generally seen as the master or mistress of the tale of terror. In other words, a supernatural tale which is eventually explained away. So at the end of the Castle of the Mistress of Udolpho, you realise that the ghost which you supposedly saw was no more than a man with a white sheet over his head. So it's like the ending of a kind of episode of Scooby-Doo, where things are explained away. In Lewis's fiction, we are asked to believe that devils do stalk the earth, that there are such things as ghosts and supernatural occurrences. And that is generally seen as the Gothic novel of horror. So the terror tradition of Radcliffe, where you explain away the wickedness in the world, or the irrational Gothic of Matthew Lewis. Okay, so Baldock explains this tradition, where suddenly this Gothic tradition of writing about the Middle Ages, tales of supernatural and so on, suddenly it becomes a tonal register, it becomes a generic term for all fiction about the supernatural, or even to the extent of just being a novel which is dominated by an air of claustrophobic evil and fear and loathing. The fashion of such a work contributed to the new emotional climate of Romanticism. In an extended sense, many novels that do not have a medievalised setting, but which share a comparably sinister, grotesque, or claustrophobic atmosphere, have been classed as Gothic. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, 1818, is a well-known example. And there are many modern tales and novels with strong Gothic elements in this sense. And of course, in the 21st century, the Gothic is one of the most popular cultural forms there is, whether in terms of the novel, or films, or TV series. So they don't have to be Gothic in the sense of the Middle Ages, but this air of, as Baldock puts it very well, sinister, grotesque, or claustrophobic atmosphere. Okay, the second cultural form is that of Romanticism. So in the 1760s, we see the rise of the Gothic novel. And it's one of the precursors of the new emotional climate of Romanticism. That's one of William Blake's illustrations of John Milton. Okay, so let's move from the Gothic to Romanticism. And of course, to many eyes, the Gothic is a kind of subset of Romanticism. Okay, so in the boldest term, Romanticism is the art form of the period between 1789 and 1832. in particular in the poetry of the Big Six, as they're known, Romantic poets: William Wordsworth, Blake, Coleridge, Shelley, Byron and Keats. And in this body of writing there's a new emphasis upon creativity and the imagination. The notion that the correct territory of poetry is individual consciousness and feeling. I mean, those of you who write poetry often might see as the point of your poetry to talk about your feelings. But before Wordsworth, this was something new. Pope doesn't write poetry about his feelings. So apart from the kind of love lyric, the notion of the preoccupation with one's own consciousness is something new in English poetry. And we have Wordsworth to thank or to blame for this. So an emphasis on the creative imagination, on individual poetic selfhood and the imagination. This is generally seen in terms of a romantic revolution. You know that the late 18th and early 19th century are revolutionary periods. There's the Industrial Revolution, which transforms the British landscape in a kind of 50-year period from the late 18th to the early 19th century. It's also a period of kind of intellectual revolt against the empiricism, the philosophical rationalism of Isaac Newton and John Locke, figures against whom the likes of Blake railed as people who have a kind of mechanistic, limiting sense of what art should be about. It's also a period of revolution, and in particular the French Revolution, which the poet Shelley said was the master theme of our epoch. So it's a period of revolutions: the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution. And the Romantic poets are all on the side of revolutionary ferment. When Wordsworth was an undergraduate at St John's in Cambridge in 1789, he hears of the fall of the Bastille and he says, "Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven." So it's a revolutionary, politically revolutionary aligned. Even though, of course, you may know that Wordsworth turns into a kind of complete Tory by the time he's in his early 40s, but nonetheless, when he battered in terms of English poetry, he's on the radical side. Okay, as well as the positive nature of the imagination, there's also in Romantic poetry a tendency with a darker side of the imaginative vision. And this is the darker side of Romanticism, which later appealed to the Surrealists, as we will see. So a preoccupation with gloomy introspection, abnormal mental states, madness, drug addiction, horror, the supernatural, the Gothic. These become key notes in the Romantic period. The horror novels of M.G. Lewis, the drug confessions of Thomas de Quincey's English opium eater. So he is an opium addict for a period of some 50 years and writes about the pains and pleasures of the narcotic fantasy. There's also a tendency to the darker side of the imagination in the works of Byron. Byron describes poetry as a curse. He says poetry is the larva of the imagination. So in Wordsworth we have the notion of an aquatic metaphor of poetry as the powerful overflowing of the overflowing of powerful feeling. But in Byron he has a kind of levatic notion of poetry as larva, the larva of the imagination. So the Gothic Fictions of Anne Radcliffe, M.G. Lewis, and John Polidori. Okay, so this is M.G. Lewis, and he is the figure who links the Gothic of the 1790s to the French and English surrealism of the 1920s and 1930s. He is a Whig MP. He's also a homosexual. There's a very kind of strong queer strand to the Gothic novel in its early days. And he writes a novel called The Monk in 1795. And it's about this monk who is the finest orator in the whole of Spain. He is in charge of he's in charge of a monastery in Spain, and he's the most pure man in Spain. He is the best preacher in Spain. He's the finest orator. But then one day in the in the monastery, he sees a kind of rather appealing-looking young man, and strange things happen within him. And it transpires that this young man is actually a woman in disguise. So he falls. So the first time his virtue is tested, he slips with this young woman. And it transpires that she is an agent of the devil. And anyway, he kind of goes to the bad in a kind of spectacular way. He murders his mother, he rapes and murders his sister, he does all kinds of diabolical things, and he ends up selling his soul to the devil. Okay, so the final scene of the monk is in the cells of the Spanish Inquisition. And he is condemned to be burnt at the stake by the Inquisition for his terrible deeds of matricide and rape and incest. And he wants to get out, as one would. And then suddenly Satan himself appears and says, just sign this piece of paper and I'll get you out of this in the blinking of an eye. So he sells his soul to the devil. But the devil, being rather diabolical, tricks him. So yes, he's out of the prison of the Spanish Inquisitions, that's good. But on the negative side, he's also hanging upside down naked above a huge ravine carried by Satan himself. So that's a contemporary picture of the final scenes of the book. And then Satan lets him go, and the monk lands at the side of a ravine, and he lingers on for 3 or 4 days in agony, and all the insects feast on his blood, and then he dies, and then Satan comes back with his minions and takes him off to hell. So it's very, very different from the polite and more restrained fiction of Mrs. Radcliffe of this period. So it's the most violent and sexually explicit of early British Gothic novels. It's themes of lust, homosexuality, incestuous rape, matricide, leagues with the devil. And it's a work which is about sexual repression. And generally, when Freudian critics have worked on the book, which they have a great length, they argue that this is a work about the unhealthy nature of sexual repression. That if you repress your sexual feelings, they will come out in a kind of negative and dark way, as they do for the monk. It also contains some scenes where a mob tear down an abbey, and the cruel abbess who's in charge of the institution is crushed and stabbed to death in an extremely graphic way. Okay, so let's move over from England to France. As Franklin was saying with reference to Polidori's The Vampire, that book was a European success in the first 5 years of its publication. It's published in France, it's published in Italy, it's published in Switzerland. So from the very beginning, Gothic novels were popular in France. And the monk sold in huge numbers in France, despite the fact that this country, the UK, was at war with France from 1793. So from the beginning, these Gothic novels had lots of admirers in France, both in terms of the ordinary reader, the common reader, as it used to be patronisingly called, but also in terms of the artists and novelists and philosophical thinkers of the 19th century. So it's a kind of truth that in the 19th century and the early 20th century, where the Gothic novel was languishing in intellectual disrepute in England, these novels were still being read in France and admired. So it's only recently that the critical disdain for the Gothic started to be overcome. Since very, very recently, when I was an undergraduate, kind of far long ago than I care to remember, in the mid-1980s, there were no courses on Gothic in this country. In the last 30 years, you will not find an English department in this land that does not have at least one module on Gothic, and many have several. There are now 3 or 4 Gothic MAs in this country. Manchester Met launched one last week. Strawberry Hill has one. The University of East Anglia has one. So in the last 30 years, we've seen the absolute revision of the Gothic novel in terms of literary criticism. Why should this be so? First of all, it's due to the importance of Freudian and psychological criticism in English literature. As Freudian ways of looking at the world became more and more influential and popular, the Gothic novel, which is a kind of, after all, a place that is strange and irrational and dark, and somehow seems to appeal to Gothic novels. It also immersed in sexuality. Gothic and sexuality are very closely aligned. So there was the influence of psychological criticism in the 70s onwards. There's also the importance of the rise of feminist criticism, because after all, almost all canonical Gothic novels in the first 50 years of the tradition feature damsels in distress. They feature the patriarchal oppressor and the hapless young woman who is being oppressed. The Castle of Otranto, Manfred's on his wedding day, his son gets crushed to death by a helmet, and there is the 18-year-old fiancé. So he says, never mind, I'll marry you instead. So, and she says, no thanks, and kind of runs off, and he tries to catch her. So there's all this kind of, you know, the notion of the damsel in distress. So the feminism also kind of worked very closely with the Gothic novel in the last 3 decades, in a sense that these are novels, in many ways, about the experience of women, and they're interesting in terms of the representation of women. The third tradition is a new willingness to historicise Gothic, to argue that Gothic is not just escapist nonsense, that actually it says important things about society. It says important things about wider civilization. Okay, and this is something which Professor David Punter, for example, who along with Bill Hughes, who you heard this morning, is probably, you know, these are the two kind of finest Gothic scholars in the land, and they are historicising Gothic. But in a way, that's new in terms of literary critical consideration in the academy, but it's quite old, as we will see, because the first of the genre's admirers in France read the works in political terms. So this is the first great admirer of Gothic in France, the infamous Marquis de Start, who, of course, bequeathed the term Sardian to European culture. So the aristocrat, pornographer, novelist, prisoner de Start. When de Start was locked up in the Bastille, and after that in the revolutionary cell, he amused himself by reading novels. And perhaps unsurprisingly, one of his absolute favourites is the Gothic. He was very keen on English Gothic novels. And in particular, he liked the notorious The Monk. You can see why a semi-pornographic novel such as The Monk appealed to the kind of uber-pornographer of the European novel. And he says this: "The Monk is superior in all respects to the exotic outburst of Mrs. Radcliffe's exotic imagination." And he had a theory about what Gothic meant. So in the preface to his novel The Crimes of Love, he says this: "Then there are the new novels, whose whole merit lies in magic and phantasmagoria, with the monk at their head, which are not entirely without merit. They are the fruit of the revolution of which all Europe has felt the shock." So he's reading in a kind of radically modern way the Gothic novel, that it is about the European turmoil of the French Revolution. And that scene where the abbess is kicked and battered and bashed to pieces, he sees this as a figuration of the French Revolution, when the ancien regime is overthrown. Okay, so that's Sard in 1800. So we want to fast forward for the last 10 or 15 minutes of this talk to talk about Surrealism. Yeah. Okay, Baldick also defines Surrealism. He says this: "An anti-rational movement in art and literature in the 1920s and 1930s, launched by André Breton in his Manifesto of Surrealism, 1924. Surrealism seeks to break down the boundaries between rationality and irrationality, exploring the resources and revolutionary energies of dreams, hallucinations, and sexual desire." And of course, Baldick notes that the adjectives surreal and surrealistic are often used in a loose sense to refer to any bizarre imaginative effect. Okay, so the Surrealists were interested in dreams, the irrational, and states beyond human consciousness. And in psychological terms, they derive much of their machinery from Freud. Surrealism is a kind of interesting mixture of Roman Catholic iconography and Freudian terminology in a kind of interesting way. And unsurprisingly, they were fascinated by Freud. Okay, so it's a very Freudian art form. Towards the late 1920s, early 1930s, Surrealism turned red, and it started to align itself with Marxism and the French Communist Party. But I want to argue in this book, which I'm working on, that the Surrealists were also greatly influenced by Romanticism and by the Gothic. I'll spare you the argument about Surrealism and British Romanticism, that's for another day. But I want to talk about what they saw in Gothic and why they saw what they saw in Gothic. Okay, so this is one of the famous canvases of Salvador Dali, who lived from 1904 to 19 89. And you will see this is not your everyday landscape. This is not something you'll see in the northeast of England every day. So an interest in the power of dreaming, in altered states beyond the rational mind. Yeah? Okay, so this is Magritte's, Rene Magritte, the Belgian surrealist, famous canvas, The False Mirror, 1928. And it betokens this preoccupation with, dare I say, the eye in surrealist thought. Yeah? Because this character is André Breton, the Pope of Surrealism. He is a novelist and poet, but most particularly a radical, revolutionary intellectual theorist. He's not a fine artist, but he is the polemical genius behind the movement. He and another person known as Georges Bataille, but I don't have time to talk about Bataille and surrealism, so we'll stick to Breton. Because an alliance of art with disease, an attraction to dark forces, the glorification of the squalid and the painful and the bizarre. So the horrors of the subconscious Freudian mind. And surrealism is noted for its intellectual extremity, especially when you're thinking about images like this from 1928, and images such as this from the 1930s. Okay, so we're going to return to the dreaming and the surrealist eye in looking at the opening sequence of the Andalusian Dog, which was which was composed by Salvador Dali and Louis Buñuel, the famous surrealist filmmaker, in 1929. And it came from a hallucinatory dream which Dali had in that evening. Surrealists saw a tradition of European culture rather different from polite French society in the 1920s. So instead of valorising Balzac or Victor Hugo, they saw a darker canonical tradition in European culture. And it started for them with the infamous Marquis de Start. Georges Bataille in particular was an enthusiastic pornographer. So this notion of épater le bourgeois, the notion of shocking the bourgeois, to be challenging and shocking and provocative. So this is from a long list of surrealist surrealist good things in the Surrealist Manifesto Breton. It's a kind of obvious parody of Marx and Engels' The Communist Manifesto. So there's a long list of things that are good, and then after that there's a long list of things that are bad, including Virgil and Homer and Shakespeare and all kinds of things like that. So anyway, the Marquis de Sade is surrealist in sadism. Monk Lewis is surrealist in the beauty of evil. Baudelaire, the infamous 19th century French poet, is surrealist in morals. Has he got any? It's kind of question that one asks. Rimbaud is surrealist in life and elsewhere. Lewis Carroll is surrealist in nonsense. Picasso is surrealist in cubism. So the Gothic becomes a tributary force in the thinking of the surrealists, and this is not an argument that's been rehearsed any time recently. So it's a kind of really interesting kind of side of this particular avant-garde movement. They look back to the horror novel, and in particular the English horror novel. Now, Breton went so far as to read almost the entire canon of English Gothic novels. And he was fascinated by that remark I read to you early on, where Walpole says, the work grew on my hands, when he's writing a tranto, almost in this kind of trance-like state. And Breton says this: the production of the work approached no less than the surrealist method. The novel must be put to the credit of dreams and the employment of automatic writing. So this is a book which comes out of a dream and has no relation, says Breton, to the conscious mind. This is something which appears in a dream and is actually no more relevant to the conscious mind than it's not relevant to the conscious mind. It is a work of the unconscious. So in England in the 1930s, there were surrealists in most of the major towns. Newcastle upon Tyne was a hotbed of surrealism. In 1936, there are surrealist enclaves in Birmingham and in London and in Bristol. So all these people read this exciting, remarkable stuff coming over from France. One of them is Hugh Sykes-Davis, who at this point is an anarchist poet and philosopher. He later becomes a professor at Cambridge and an expert on Wordsworth, but he writes an essay called Surrealism at this time, 1936. Consider the astonishing development of the horror novel in the Romantic period. Mother Radcliffe, Monk Lewis, the inspired Maturin, that's C.R. Maturin, the Irish novelist and author of Melmoth the Wanderer, 1920. Melancholy, rape, gloomy landscape, and spiritual torture. And these are all good things in the surrealist kind of mindset. Thoroughly earned for these works the continental title Les Romans Noirs, the Black Novels. So, as I say, in France, the Gothic is taken seriously and is read and bought and intellectually theorised. In England, it's not. As I say, it wasn't until the 70s and 80s that people started to take Gothic seriously in critical terms. But Reid, Herbert Reid, the art historian and an artist, says this: as early as 1936, Monk Lewis, Maturin and Mrs. Radcliffe should, relatively to Scott, Dickens and Hardy, occupy a much higher rank in the English canon. If you go to a kind of professor of English at University College London in 1936 and say, why don't you teach Lewis or Radcliffe, they would have kind of shown you the door in a very kind of gentlemanly manner. That this is not the right kind of stuff to be teaching undergraduate students of English. So it's now the Gothic is prevalent, back then it wasn't. So this is a minority of voice. And again, it's coming out of that French tradition of respect for the Gothic. Okay, so in conclusion, what are we to make of surrealism? Is it mere shock value, or is its attention to dark sights of pain and agony a revolutionary art? David Gascoigne, the poet and English surrealist of the 1930s, says this: surrealism is the lineal heir of Romanticism. The great task of our century, like theirs, is destroying worn-out customs and institutions and constructions. So these men, both in England and France, are deep political radicals, and they see political efficacy in the previous example of the Romantic poets. So in the 1920s and 30s, in English poetry in general, Romanticism is not taken seriously because Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot and the likes of T.E. Hugh, the modernist philosopher, are attacking Romanticism on behalf of the modernist aesthetic. But the radical, revolutionary Marxist surrealists are saying something different. They are prioritising Romantic poetry and the Gothic novel. They see in the revolutionary enthusiasm of Wordsworth and Byron and Shelley a model for their own day. And Breton says as much explicitly. At the time I am writing, there is no doubt that a new French Revolution has begun. A sentence which is spectacularly wrong, of course, but nonetheless. Surrealism is its art, belonging to its period, in the same manner, you should say, in which, whether we like it or not, the style of the Gothic novel may be seen as symbolic of the social troubles in which Europe was enveloped at the end of the 18th century. So he's seeing an analogy between a revolutionary art of the 1930s to the revolutionary art of the 1790s, which is best exemplified in Romanticism, but perhaps even more particularly in the cultural and social meanings of the Gothic novel. So, in conclusion, in the Gothic novel, surrealism found an art of revolution, which mirrored its own aspiration to Marxist revolution. And in Gothic's dreaming, horror and morbidity, surrealism found a precursor to its own audacious and shocking artistic methods. Thank you.